So, I would like to introduce to you all our speaker today, who is Professor Kevin Deegan-Krause from Wayne State University. He got his bachelor's in economics from Georgetown and his PhD in government international studies from Notre Dame. And his research focuses on political parties and democracy. So, he has a wonderful presentation for us today, and I am excited to let him take it away.
Great. So thank you, Danny. Thanks to everybody. Thanks for the invitation. And let me just start, as I always do, with a few caveats and explanations. First, if you can hear me, the volume level is good. I've learned from years of teaching now online, especially during the pandemic, that some people can hear and some can't. So if someone can give me a thumbs up if the volume level is about right, and if you can see something that says understanding accountability with 4 orange dots on your screen. So if that's good, then we're good on that. Second thing, if I could ask, in my experience around a lot of these things, it is if you wait until the end to ask questions, at least when I wait to the end, I've completely forgotten what my questions are. So if you've got a really pertinent kind of short question, I would ask you to shout it out. Or in some way, and I'm not easily able while I'm presenting, because I'm going to be annotating the presentation, to watch. So if there is somebody who could watch the chat, or if somebody who could watch the hands up, if you don't feel comfortable shouting up, maybe someone could intervene on your behalf and say, Rich has a question or Kathy has a question, and so on. So if you don't mind doing that, I find the conversations go pretty well that way. So enough of that. A couple of other sort of disclaimers. First is that I do teach at Wayne State University, but I want to say that while I've learned a ton at that institution, and I love that institution, what I'm going to say today is going to be entirely my own work and my own thoughts, and don't reflect the views of the university. It seems a little strange to say that, but the modern era has moved in such a way that I feel like it's necessary. It's probably actually would have been nice if we'd been doing that all along. But so this is my stuff. This is my own work, and whatever Wayne State may think about a variety of things, this is not its formal opinion. Second caveat is that knowing a little bit about your organization, I'm afraid that what I'm going to say today might be insufficiently vehement, might be insufficiently radical in a way. And I say that just as a kind of warning. I do have some thoughts that go beyond what I want to talk about today. But today really is built on my academic work, and I've tried to design a presentation that I can take to a variety of audiences, regardless of their political views, because a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is, I think, acceptable across a wide range of political views. Maybe not some of it, but much of the American political spectrum used to believe what I'm going to talk about today. And as we'll get to at the end, I really feel like it's important to be able to reach out across lines. I think that's the only way we're going to solve a lot of these problems. So we can go further. We can do something that's a little bit more kind of strong at the end. But I want to give you some basic stuff, and I hope a lot of this isn't repetition for many of you. But what I want to do is take some of my experience working on politics in other countries, and I want to bring it back home to the United States. And let me start by acknowledging the origins of what I am talking about. Many of you may know that there is alleged to be a Chinese curse. May you live in interesting times. It is apparently not an actual Chinese curse. It is a phrase invented by a British nobleman who was looking for a way to sort of caricature some thinking that he encountered in China in the 19th century. But regardless of whether it's a real Chinese curse or not, it certainly feels like one these days. And in my life, there is a new kind of curse, a new rephrasing of that curse, which regards my own research. So I am a political scientist. I've spent about 35 years of my life living and working in Central and Eastern Europe. And when I went over as a kind of young, naive American, thinking that American ways were somehow superior, and that I could go as a kind of messenger of democracy to countries that had only recently given up deeply totalitarian and really punishing systems. And to a certain extent, I think the notion of democracy has benefited the countries that I study, and these are better places. And as some people have said of the countries that I study, particularly Czech Republic and Slovakia, Poland, and that these countries have never had such a period of relatively sustained peace, prosperity, growth, and public engagement in politics. There are flaws, but this is certainly a better period than before. So there were great things to bring there. But what I have discovered, unfortunately, is that there are a lot of things that I have had to bring from there back home. This wasn't the way it was supposed to work. I wasn't supposed to take my work on authoritarian systems in Eastern Europe and bring them back to the United States as a kind of lesson. But here we are. And I owe a lot of what I have to say today to this gentleman, Vladimir Mečiar, not because he was a particularly insightful scholar or even a particularly nice guy, but because he was a proto-dictator of a country that I lived in at the time. I spent a lot of time in the Czech Republic and especially in Slovakia. And between about 1992 and about 1998, I watched as this gentleman systematically dismantled Slovakia's governing institutions, particularly a lot of its democratic institutions. And I was so fascinated by it that I ended up writing a dissertation on it, 500 pages of paper and ink later. I thought I'd figured out what had gone on in Slovakia. And a big part of that is what I'm going to be bringing, unfortunately, home to you today. So in the process, I've also had a chance to look at some other governments in the region. So the government of Jarosław Kaczynski in Poland, the government of Alexander Vučić in Serbia, and some of you may know the government of Viktor Orban in Hungary. There are others as well that I could mention, but these are the ones that sort of stand out in the lessons they have to give to the United States, unfortunately, at the moment. Certainly, Orban is trying to give lessons to the United States, to the people on his side of the United States battle. But I think in looking at Mečiar and Kaczynski and Vučić and Orban, we can learn some lessons on the other side. And really, the question is, what happens when a leader or a team of leaders systematically dismantles the institutions that we hold dear? So when I did this, I ended up turning my dissertation into a book. It's the kind of thing you have to do as an academic if you want to keep your job. And I started with a chapter that, in retrospect, Democracy Amid Division, looks really too familiar. I did not have the United States in my mind when I wrote this chapter title. But what I'm going to talk about today are the next two chapters and how those are relevant, which are the accountability gap and accountability in institutions. So what happens when you get a gap in accountability and how does that affect your institutions? So let me talk about this notion of accountability. It's a pretty common word, although it's a pretty long word. And it is a word that gets used a lot in academic spaces, and particularly in political science. One of the things that I love to do, and I'd recommend to all of you when you encounter words or when you encounter ideas, is to go and find out where those words are from. So one of my favorite sites in the world is called Etym Online. It's the etymology online site. And when you go there, you find out where words come from. And so accountability actually comes from the word account, which means to sort of reckon together or sort of come together with. Compute becomes count. Compute means to think with or reckon with. And in this case, accountable means that you can be called to account, that somebody can say, hey, why did you do that? Hey, what are you doing? And if you've ever had to sit and be called into the principal's office, or if you've ever had a boss tell you that you're being called in for your annual performance review, you know exactly what I mean by accountability. It is this ability of somebody to call somebody else to explain themselves and then take steps beyond that. It turns out that accountability is incredibly important in democracy. So we think democracy is ruled by the people, but just ruled by the people without any kinds of internal structures and organizations has certain limits, certain vulnerabilities. And so built into the idea or the definition of democracy is the notion of accountability. Now, the first part of that clearly is the accountability of rulers to rule. And so we call this vertical accountability because it deals with a difference in power. So there's an above and there's a below. Most of the time, the accountability in government is vertical from the leaders to the ruled. So for most days out of every 4 years, people are told what to do. They're told to pay their taxes. They're told to stop at those red octagonal signs. And they're told to do a variety of other stuff, some more useful than others. But we think about that as a kind of vertical accountability. But the real vertical accountability of democracy, which is what makes democracy different, is that every 4 years, two in the case of Congress, we flip that upside down. And it's not us who are accountable to the leaders, but it is the leaders who are theoretically accountable to us. So it's not sort of vertical down, but vertical up. And we as citizens get the ability to say to the leaders, actually, I don't like what you're doing, and I want someone else to hold that position for now. So this vertical accountability, this is basically what the first thing we think about when we think about democracy. It is the ability of the people to replace leaders. But there is also another kind of accountability that's really important, because if the only kind of accountability we had was the accountability of people to replace leaders, and then let those leaders rule for a while, first thing those leaders would probably do is to try and change things so that they didn't have to face the people again. In fact, that's what we see in a whole variety of circumstances. And so vertical accountability to the people, at least in the form of elections, isn't enough. And our founders knew this, and people who have developed these kinds of systems around the world have known this, that what you really need is a kind of horizontal, sometimes called institutional accountability. You need somebody to be able to hold leaders to account, to be able to explain themselves and so on, when the elections are not happening. So somebody's got to be out there. This is actually the framework that we in the United States know as checks and balances. I teach undergraduate students, and the one thing that seems to stick with them from their high school civics courses is the idea of checks and balances, and the sort of related separate notion that we have separation powers in order to maintain those checks and balances. So we've got organizations, institutions that can tell other institutions what to do, can tell them to stop doing those particular things. So we've got vertical accountability in elections, we've got horizontal accountability in between, and more recent work on democracy said, that's not really enough, because there is a kind of accountability that's neither. It is institutional, it involves institutions, but not formal institutions, not governmental institutions. So in that sense, those institutions are more like the institutions of the people. And so here we talk about diagonal accountability. By diagonal accountability, it's sometimes called also social accountability or civic accountability or watchdog accountability. What they mean here is that there are institutions out there in society that are also responsible for helping keep institutions in check. They may not have the formal ability to tell them no, but they have the ability to watch, they have the ability to monitor, they have the ability to try and shame, to do social sanctions, they have the ability to mobilize people to public events, they have the ability to encourage people to think very seriously about voting for somebody else, which may encourage politicians to by themselves stop their negative behaviors sometimes, not always, as we see in the current environment. But diagonal institutions are institutions of journalism, institutions of the nonprofit sphere, even sometimes institutions within the market, so unions and even sometimes corporations and so on. These are the kinds of organizations that can sometimes watch, they can sometimes impose sanction, and they can have an impact or an effect. So this is our menu of accountability, and all of these kinds of accountability are necessary if we want to keep particular individuals, especially individuals in the most important power positions, prime minister or president, from using the power of those positions for their own benefit and to undermine all of the other things that we associate with democracy. So this is where I want to go, and I want to apply this to the United States, but I want to stop for a second and see if anybody's got any questions or any thoughts before I go to there. Any input? As you all know, it's a little hard with Zoom to know kind of where people are at and so on. But if I don't hear anybody else, then I'm just going to go to the next step. Wait, actually, I see the chat. So I've just switched over to the chat. Expand on accountability of unions, please. I will get to that, Sherry, when I get to another section, but you are exactly sort of anticipating where I'm going to go. So this is our frame of accountability. Where are we now with accountability? First thing I want to say, excuse me, sorry about this. First thing I want to say I gave this presentation to the League of Women Voters on Thursday, and that was left over from them. So apologize for that. But so where are we now with accountability? First thing I've got to do when I do this actually is to sort of define a little bit more what I mean by accountability. So in that book that I wrote quite a long time ago now, I ended up, after a long struggle with the concept, sort of identifying, building on the work of others to identify 4 key elements of accountability: codification, oversight, sanction, and independence. You can probably read your screen. But what I mean by that, in much simpler words, there got to be rules. You got to be able to see the behavior of the people in power. You got to be able to do something about the behavior in power, and you got to want to be able to do something about what the people in power are doing. So if you take away any one of these, you're going to have a really hard time exerting that horizontal accountability. If there are no rules, then who can tell you what not to do? If there's no visibility, then nobody's going to be able to see it and stop you. If there are no consequences, they're just going to do it anyway. And if there's no motivation, if there are consequences, but there's no motivation to impose those consequences, you get in the same instance. And this is something we're seeing a lot of these days. So how do we in the US stack up with regard to these particular rules, these particular notions? That's what I want to talk about today. And first thing I want to say on this is that these kinds of rules, these kinds of frameworks, I think these cut pretty clearly across the political spectrum. These are not simply virtues of the left. They, in fact, in some ways, were at one point virtues of the right as well, at least certain kinds of the right. And so, when we think about kind of what people would have valued, I think had I been giving this presentation 20, 30 years ago, I don't think there would have been a big difference between the 2 major political parties in the United States, or really even smaller parties in the United States, on whether these things were important or not. What seems to have shifted quite radically is the tendency of one of the 2 political parties, or at least the dominant faction in that political party, to reject many of these as unnecessary or overly restrictive or simply dumb. And so what can we do? What can we say about these particular things? I want to do some general thoughts, and then I want to talk about some specifics with regard to specific institutions. In general, codification of rules, the United States does have a lot of rules, but what I've been surprised at, what I really didn't see, even though I do this for a living, is that the codification of rules is not as robust in the United States as I would have thought. It's really not robust anywhere because you really can't anticipate all of the rules. If you've got someone who really, really wants to break these rules, you can't anticipate everything that they're going to do. But I was surprised in the last 8 years at the degree to which what we thought were pretty kind of firm rules of democracy actually turn out not to be. So it turns out that there are not as many rules as we think they are, and that a lot of what we build democracy on is common understandings, is trust, is informal relationships, is norms, and so on. And for this, I give incredible credit to 2 of my academic colleagues at other institutions, but Steve Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, in a book that many of you may have read, really call attention to the degree to which a lot of what we do is built on those informal relationships, those informal norms. And they talk about the soft guardrails of democracy. So not the hard ones, not the rules that you can see, but the kind of soft shoulder that keeps you from fully going off the road, the little bumps on the edge that say, hey, we're into a different place. And they emphasize the degree to which really a lot of what we do in democracy is built around particular norms. Problem with that is that if you have a particular leader who is brought up in an environment, a corporate environment, where norms, those political norms aren't relevant or aren't interesting, if you have someone who simply rejects norms or regards himself as a norm breaker, then there's not a lot to keep people from doing what they simply want to do, because it turns out that those things are not codified. Some of you may remember back to the old Far Side cartoons, and one of my favorite Far Side cartoons has a couple of cowboys huddling next to a covered wagon while arrows are flying in at them. And one of the cowboys says to the other, they're lighting their arrows. Can they do that? And I think what we're finding is that we are in a realm where we didn't know that there weren't rules for the things that we weren't doing. So a lot of things that the current administration has done are simply sort of workarounds or efforts they take the ordinary rules, but they realize that you don't have to do them. I don't think that Congress, when it created the Department of Education, was anticipating that the president, instead of abolishing the Department of Education, would simply just fire everybody, would simply stop funding things. Those were not kind of in that frame of expectation. And one of the remarkable things about this current administration and its previous iteration was the degree to which it's unbound by the norms that shape what we do. And it kind of works to rule, but if it works to rule, it turns out there aren't that many rules. You can't figure out, codify everything. And so it turns out there is a lot more leeway than we thought. The second thing that I think we have to deal with in the current political environment is the question of oversight and whether the actions being taken can actually be seen. Now, on this, I think we've got some sort of mixed results because on the one hand, this has not been an administration that is particularly shy about what it's doing. I mean, for it, a lot of its violations are not a feature, not a bug, but they're a feature, right? That they are trying to break the system that they see as bad for America, or however you want to interpret it. But they're simply, in many cases, saying outright exactly what they're going to do. For the first time this administration was in power, I think a lot of people are like, "Wow, they're saying that, but they're not going to actually do it." I think we know actually what they mean now when they say they're going to do these things. They don't care about these particular rules or so on. They actually really don't. So on the one hand, a lot of what we're seeing is it's uncodified, but it's quite visible. I mean, you can see those things. The question is whether you can do anything about it. On the other hand, I will say there are a lot of ways in which this particular administration has deliberately obscured things. A lot of that has to do with the deliberate the deliberate abandonment of data gathering efforts, the deliberate effort of creating anonymity or hiding faces and so on. So on the one hand, the administration is doing what it's doing quite out in the open, but it is removing the ability of people to see who's doing them, to see what's actually happening as a result of what they're doing. And so in that case, we actually are seeing a decrease in visibility that really affects the fundamental way that we operate in democracy, and that is really worrisome. Third thing is the question. I mean, if there are rules and if we can see what's going on, can we do anything about it? And to the extent there are rules, those rules do offer remedies. The question is whether those remedies are sufficient to deter anyone, and whether those remedies come in time. And I think, as we've seen in a lot of cases, when the administration does certain things, many of the things they've done have not just been violation of rules and norms, but violation of actual law. But when they violate the law, what happens? In this case, the government doesn't stop doing what it's doing. It keeps doing it, and people sue. And in some cases, courts get involved and courts say, stop doing that. Whether the government actually does stop doing that, I think depends on the circumstances. In many cases, the Supreme Court has allowed the government to continue doing what it's doing until that decision gets to the Supreme Court. And the question here is a question of duration, the question of timing, because there are certain kinds of things that once you do them are not easily undone. A friend of mine works in Seattle, and he says there is a culture in Seattle, especially apparently at Amazon, where they talk a lot about one-way doors and two-way doors. Two-way doors, you can go through them, you can come back. So if you make a mistake, you can fix that mistake. One-way doors, those are the doors that you go through. It's kind of like at the airport. Once you leave the terminal, it's going to be hard as hell to get back in. And so the question here is, whether these are one-way doors and two-way. If they're two-way doors, if you can go through them and come back, then legal redress may be adequate. May not be adequate for the people who are hurt in the meantime, but it might allow you to get back to where you were before. But there are certain things that are one-way doors. If you put a bull in a china shop, you can get the bull out of the china shop, but you're not going to get the china back together. And so a lot of the things that I think we've seen happen in the United States, particularly in that first just chaotic 2 or 3 months, are things that are broken, and probably broken beyond immediate repair. Things like the U.S. Agency for International Development, but more than that, things like just the sheer amount of talent and expertise that are lost in the State Department, in other federal organizations, things like trust. that are being eroded increasingly rapidly. Trust is easy to lose and very hard to regain. And that is also particularly true in the international realm. So we see this going on right now with regard to NATO. Is it going to be possible ever to trust the United States again, even if there is some control and some way to do something about the things that are going on? And so you've got to you've got to know that those consequences are able to be done in time to actually solve the problem. And in many cases they're not. And in many cases the long-term damage of this administration is going to come from having done things that you can reverse, but by the time you've reversed them, they're already done. Finally, there's the question of motivation. And here, I think we can talk a little bit about what's been going on at the federal level and about the mechanisms or institutions of accountability. And, one of the things, as I mentioned, that my students do seem to remember is that there are three branches of government, that those are supposed to hold one another in check. And I think when we look at this simple and sort of painfully naive model, we see the ways in which under this administration that simply has not been true. So the first actually thing is on the executive side. We don't normally think of the executive holding itself in check, but in fact, the way that the US governmental system has been set up over the past 100 years or so is actually to build restraints into the government, the executive branch itself. The executive branch is so big and congressional control can be so problematic in terms of timing that it might be necessary to regulate from the inside. At least that's what we used to think, Republicans and Democrats alike. And so within the administrative agencies, there are a whole variety of accountability mechanisms, including inspectors general. And of course, one of the first things that the administration did was to fire all of the people who are responsible for making sure that federal agencies, that the cabinet departments don't break their own rules, that people aren't harassed, that money isn't wasted or given to people who don't deserve it, and so on. And of course, a lot of those folks are now gone. So one of the first things the administration did was to remove its own internal accountability mechanisms. And certainly the same thing is true with the Department of Justice. This is a little bit awkward because the Department of Justice is, on the one hand, America's prosecutor, but on the other hand, it is a federal agency whose secretary is appointed by the president. There's always been a kind of tense relationship. I'm sure almost everyone on this call remembers the 1970s when the role of the Department of Justice as the office of the president versus an office of the country as a whole came into play. At that time, it was scandalous enough, but I think now what we're seeing something that really takes that and makes it look quite pale by comparison to what we're seeing now, where the president actively sees the Department of Justice as his own lawyer, not just to prevent things happening against him, but to be able to use those as tools against other people. And so we've seen, Department of Justice efforts, investigations against virtually all of the president's major opponents, from Mark Kelly to now apparently the Minnesota governor to the head of the Federal Reserve. That the mechanism, the Department of Justice, far from being a restraint, has actually become a tool. This is part of something that we'll see a little bit later on. This is something that moves into a space where even Republicans are wondering whether this is the right way to go, perhaps because they see the problem with the future, that if you remove these kind of constraints now, then what's to prevent a future president from using them against others? At least some people seem to be thinking that way. And it's not just these organizations. There are a whole variety of organizations that were set up by acts of Congress signed by the president that have a kind of hybrid function, that are responsible to keep oversight over many aspects of American politics and cultural and economic life. And one of the first things that we've seen is that the president has either shuttered these, like the Bureau of Consumer Financial Protection, or removed members with organizations like the Federal Trade Commission or the Federal Election Commission, or somehow, in other words, hampered their activities, as in the case of the Securities and Exchange Commission, and we're seeing now potentially the Federal Reserve. I went online and looked for this, a group called the Center for Ethics. They're a left-leaning group, but I double-checked a lot of their findings. This is a list of people who have been fired since the beginning of the Trump administration in reverse chronological order. It's a long list. And a lot of these people have been removed, playing fundamental roles in the federal bureaucracy and in the executive's own constraints on itself. As I mentioned, if what I've been saying hasn't been bad news enough, there is some bad news that I learned in Slovakia, which is certainly coming true in the United States at the moment, which is when you've got mechanisms of accountability that are functioning, two institutions are able to sort of keep each other in check. But if one institution actually manages to fully take control over that mechanism of accountability, you sort of break the mechanisms of accountability that are embodied in inspectors general or in control the ethos of independence in the Department of Justice, or the actual independence of the Federal Election Commission, or so on. Once you've done that, it's not simply the fact that that's no longer a useful accountability mechanism, but it turns out that it's now an accountability mechanism which can be wielded against other accountability mechanisms. This is where it gets a little bit scary, because it's not just that the DOJ no longer is watching the president. It's that the DOJ can be used against the president's opponents. It's not just that the Federal Election Commission has rules that the president can't break. It's that the president can now use the Federal Election Commission against his political opponents, and so on. And so really, it's a little bit like playing a video game. You beat one institution, and then you can actually absorb that institution's powers, and you can use it against the next institution, along with the powers that you've already had. And so this is something I think we're seeing, and it is one of the reasons why accountability is so important, and why maintaining all of those relationships is important. Because once you lose one, it's not just a loss; it's potentially a gain for the other side. We can also look at motivation in terms of Congress, and here I just don't have much to say. I was kind of shocked by the degree to which the members of Congress, particularly in the majority, have simply kind of laid down and let the president do what the president wanted. I come from an era when I worked on Capitol Hill while I was in college. Congresspeople, senators were jealous of their own prerogatives. Even if a president from their own party wanted to do something, if it worked against the powers of their institution, they would often side for the institution over the party. That simply doesn't seem to be happening anymore. I think the president has enough powers to threaten individual legislators. I think there are enough true believers among the legislators, and the president has a particular vision for America that between the two, they seem to have simply laid down. That may not be true as much anymore. There seems to be some stirring, but it's probably come a little bit too late. And the Democratic Party doesn't seem to have sort of gotten its act together in this regard. Not that there's much that a minority party can actually do. I was at a No Kings rally, the one in August, I think, and I saw someone with a sign that said, "If only Congress were alive to see this." And sometimes it feels that way, that Congress is actually dead. And then there's the Supreme Court. And again, there's not a whole lot to say about the Supreme Court, except that it seems to have pretty much absorbed the presidential agenda, that it has consistently enunciated a pretty strong notion of executive supremacy over Congress, if not over the court itself. It has been pretty willing to let the president do whatever the president wants, up to and including a really kind of very narrow set of conditions under which presidents can be prosecuted for anything, so a high degree of immunity, and also just a broader vision and the willingness to allow the administration to do what it's doing until such time as it gets to the court, by which time, as we've seen, Bull in a China shop, many things are already broken. So that really is the kind of framework that we're seeing: removal of accountability within the places that the government, that the president has control over, and really kind of willingness to abet the president's behavior among the institutions which normally we would have counted on for that accountability. It doesn't present a very rosy picture, at least for those horizontal mechanisms of accountability. And then we have questions of diagonal accountability. And so here really is where we're looking at the ability of other organizations to keep administrations in check. In this case, those organizations have to have sanctions. They're not necessarily rules here, but they have to be able to see what's going on. They have to be able to have some kind of consequence or some kind of sanction. So even if that's only bringing things to the public eye, in the hopes that voters will get the hint and vote in certain ways. And they also have to have the motivation to be able to do it. I will say one of the things that I've seen in studying Eastern and Central Europe is the degree to which governments have quickly gone after these diagonal institutions, particularly journalism, particularly nonprofit sector, and bringing other sectors around. To what extent can these organizations actually have a kind of say? It seems that they are threatening enough in Eastern and Central Europe that governments actually seek to silence them, seek to control them. And I don't think what's happening in the United States has been particularly different. It's been a little bit erratic. Journalism was already in a difficult situation because of the fundamental change in the media landscape and funding models, so that it is very hard to produce good journalism these days with the combination of social media as a source for lots of people's information and the inability or the difficulty of actually finding revenues for responsible journalism. So journalism is facing a lot of problems. And then adding to that are lawsuits by the president, are efforts by the president to control those media corporations that control journalistic organizations and so on. And then in addition to that, we've got other sort of potential accountability mechanisms. We've got states that can work here that's maybe a brighter light than in some of the other realms, because states, at least for all their limitations vis-a-vis the federal government in terms of size and power, are emboldened by our federal system. So we're seeing states, particularly blue states and blue state attorney generals and blue state governors, actually being some of the strongest proponents of diagonal accountability and doing some of that work. There's not a lot they can do to control the federal government. They can do a fair amount to resist it. The nonprofit sector has faced a lot of difficulties also in terms of funding, and it seems particularly under fire. There are questions about to what extent the federal government will begin, as has happened in Hungary, to use groups like the IRS and other organizations to start investigating nonprofits. Certainly, we've seen some of that in the past, and efforts to identify nonprofits with terrorist organizations or to remove their tax-exempt status, which would be the death knell for a lot of these. We've also seen what's happened in academia. Obviously, some of the bigger name universities came very quickly under the fire of the administration. The fact that those organizations, in many cases, simply knuckled under because of the gigantic role that federal grants play in their operations, I think plays an important role. But it's not necessary to go after every academic institution. And I can tell you, as someone who lives in the world of academia, once the big institutions were targeted, a lot of the smaller or less powerful institutions immediately started to look at ways to make themselves less vulnerable. Hence, in other words, my disclaimer when I started today and other things that are going on. Law firms, corporations, unions, other organizations can also exert some accountability, but all of these organizations have been targeted in one form or another. Law firms and corporations, obviously, with regard to contracts, unions with regard to investigations, and so on. Unions, had been in the United States experiencing at least a minor renaissance. Unions do have a certain power in particular sectors, and we've seen in the auto industry and others the ability to actually force concessions and so on. Whether those can have a powerful role, Sherry, this is regarding your question, I think is an important question, and the ability of those unions to work with other sectors. But we're also seeing the way in which those organizations are under fire. And then finally, there is the question of vertical accountability. If I haven't given you a rosy picture so far, I would encourage you not to expect a rosy picture here. This may be the strongest element. This is the one that's maybe most deeply entrenched in American life, or at least the one that has the most advocates, because those advocates are decentralized and across the board. It is one of the expectations, the fundamental expectations of Americans, though maybe not as deeply inculcated as we thought. But what we really see here is the fact that elections are complicated things. And so actually exerting vertical accountability is more difficult to do than you might think, and easier to interfere with than you might think. One of the things I do at Wayne is to teach a course on elections and electoral systems. And toward that end, I've built a kind of framework for how to understand the complexity of institutions. I think everyone on this call, not a lot of Americans, but everyone on this call has a sense of how truly complicated elections are. Many of you, I suspect, have worked elections. If you haven't, I would really encourage you to do it. We're going to need all the help we can get in the coming elections. But every election involves hundreds of decisions. And when it's done right, as it is almost always in the United States these days, nobody asks any of those questions because their experience at the ballot box is seamless. They walk in, they vote, they leave. But for those of us who run elections, for those of us who think about that, there are hundreds of questions. This is something that I use with my students, but there are hundreds of questions about how we actually organize those particular elections. Every single one of these is a place where somebody could interfere with elections, and you lose enough of these, and then you actually lose the full functioning of the American democratic system, or any democratic system. Robert Dahl, pretty famous political scientist in the 1970s, actually defined a much sort of simpler frame about what you need for elections and vertical accountability to actually work. You can see that list. I'll talk about a couple in detail. Part of them are areas around, and this actually relates to that question of diagonal accountability. You need freedom to associate, and organizations that will do that, like the NGOs that we've talked about, the nonprofit sector. You need to be able to free to express yourself, and people need to be able to get that administration. We've seen efforts to restrict raw freedom of expression, sometimes by deliberate efforts, and sometimes by sort of threats around that deliberate expression. We've seen the alternative sources of information as well. So here the federal government has sought, in many cases, to undermine sources of information by threatening news media. But we also see a kind of natural devolution in many ways, in terms of people getting social media, or getting their news from social media or from other forms of media that are dominated by corporations who have a stronger interest at the moment, at least in many ways, at keeping themselves from being regulated by the federal government or overregulated by the federal government than they do at actually providing people the information that they actually need. And the more concentrated the media sphere gets, the more concentrated the social media sphere gets, the easier it is to control those particular spaces. So this is not an area of positive expression. I am deeply grateful every day for sources like the Bridge Detroit and Bridge Michigan, sources for me like NPR and PBS. Fully aware that there are lots of media sources that are currently under fire, and that there are lots of people who are not getting real news because of the nature of the programming that they're watching, or the feeds that they're accessing. The other question, and actually one of the things that I would just mention as an aside, and this isn't meant as a plug, but I work for a group called Voters Not Politicians. I suspect some of you may have been volunteered with them or worked in the past. Many of you may be gathering signatures for an effort to keep corporate money out of politics, to regulate the amount of corporate money that goes into political conversations like this. If you haven't heard about this, I'm glad to talk about it when we finish, or talk about it in the chat. The other thing, and I'm getting close to the end here, so I appreciate your patience, but is this question about the right to vote, the right to be elected, the right to compete for votes in elections that are free and fair. You don't need to completely wreck democracy in order to shape American elections. American elections are pretty narrow. The last election was decided by about 1.6%. That's a swing of 0.8%, or less than 1% of the vote. And actually, if you look at the states that switch from one to another, the number of voters is ridiculously small. And so, if you really do want to mess with American elections, you don't have to go in and call a halt to those elections or cancel them. You can mess around on the edges in terms of the information that people are receiving, or the way that elections are conducted. And this is one of the things that keeps me up at night, because I really hope, but fear that American elections are more vulnerable than we might think. There are lots of things that a federal government could do. This is a list that a group of colleagues of mine have been working on. They've sort of brought it down to a smaller group, and this is actually the work of what's called the Brennan Center for Justice. The Brennan Center has identified 4 particular areas where they fear that the federal government could try and shift the results of the upcoming midterms or the upcoming general elections in 2026 and 2028. Some of those are about rewriting election rules in ways that make it more difficult for people to vote. There are a bunch of executive orders whose legal viability is questionable at best. But there have also been a variety of interventions by the Department of Justice. I mentioned the fact that the Department of Justice, rather than acting as an accountability mechanism, can act as an accountability violator. And that's certainly the case with these requests for voter rolls and election data and for direct intervention into states' politics. Michigan itself has seen requests from the Michigan State House and Michigan Republican legislators for federal oversight because the Secretary of State is actually running in an election that her group is charged with overseeing. This is actually a problem more broadly in America, that we do not have independent election monitoring organizations like many countries do. But in this case, it seems to invite federal intervention in what's going on. We also see a variety of efforts in the state to change the state laws in order to require proof of citizenship for voting, which is different than proof of ID. So you may be aware that there is a group out there collecting collecting signatures for a proof of signature referendum. That kind of referendum actually, unfortunately, is quite popular with voters. It has passed in many states that it has been brought up in. So if enough signatures are collected, that would be a pretty bad thing. And there are groups out there trying to get people to decline to sign those particular petitions, but it would have a pretty catastrophic impact on the way that people, the way that many people vote. You've seen from my own hyphenated name, I do not have the same name that I had on my birth certificate. I'm lucky because I have a passport, but there are a lot of people, particularly women, who don't, and there are a lot of people who have neither passports nor their original birth certificate. It would make it difficult or impossible for them to vote. There are also direct efforts, as I mentioned, to target those officials who are responsible for keeping elections free and fair. So the Attorney General's Task Force on Protection, Integrity of Elections, the DOJ has switched its emphasis from trying to prevent institutional kind of limits on participation to voting to actually trying to identify the incredibly rare instances of actual electoral fraud. And so there is a shift in that direction. There has been some deliberate efforts by the federal government to support those people who have tried to undermine election administration, I mean, ranging from the symbolic but real pardons for the people who were involved on January 6th, to efforts to support people who are being indicted at the state level for tampering with voting, seizing voting machines, and so on. We've seen that in Michigan and Colorado and other places. And then finally, simply the government's withdrawal from its efforts to keep elections free and fair by really withdrawing from the Voting Rights Act and shifting the voting efforts from free and fair voting to, as I mentioned, the non-existent problem of electoral fraud. So there's a lot that's going on by the federal government that could interfere at the level of vertical accountability and could interfere with our next elections. Which brings me to the last thing, which is what we can do. And I wish I had a really big list here of things that you could do actively. First thing you can do actually is what you're doing right now, which is to gather on a regular basis and keep yourself informed. First thing I would say to do is, I think it's okay for us to be sad. This is not what I expected American democracy would look like in my senior years. And I am really, I lament this. I look at it and I don't think there's any way around it. I think we've got to look at it and say, yeah, this wasn't what I was expecting. This wasn't what I was hoping for. This wasn't the legacy that I wanted to bequeath to my children, grandchildren. But how do we be sad without despairing? So what can we do out there? There are certain things to do. First thing for me is to really be aware of the threats to vertical accountability, to be aware of the threats at the next election. I don't think, I hope that there are not going to be sort of massive efforts to manipulate the election, but I'm also aware that there don't have to be massive efforts. There only have to be sort of half-hearted but dangerous efforts to question the viability, the validity of the elections, to undermine people's confidence in the system overall, that could have disastrous consequences for the 26-28 period and really bad consequences for the the 28 presidential elections. And so anything we can do, pay attention to any opportunity. I know Voters Not Politicians is working on this. The ACLU is working on this. A variety of other civic organizations are working on this. There are efforts in place to build election defense efforts for 26 and for 28. Anytime you hear about those, I would encourage you to get involved in any of those and be ready on election day in 26. I've been talking to people about the importance that we're going to have of doing our absentee balloting. I know a lot of us like to vote in person, but getting those absentee ballots in well in advance in 26 so that we are available on election day if we're needed for things. So I would encourage you to do that. And any group, any organization, I was just talking to the League of Women Voters, they're certainly engaging in these kinds of efforts, and a bunch of other groups are as well. If you find something, do it, let your friends know, and so on. Toward that end, I would say keep learning and teaching. I appreciate you inviting me on this for what is by now an interminable lecture. But I really would encourage you to keep learning from as many sources as you can. And then this is the next step that people don't always realize is go off and tell other people. So take what you've learned, synthesize it. You don't have to drone on to people like I'm doing here to you, but you can tell people in small snippets about what's going on, and be a teacher. Be the person who communicates the dangers of the current moment to others to let them know. And then the third thing is to make allies. And I'm not always sure how this is going to land, but I would really encourage you to think as broadly, as wide and far as possible in terms of making those particular connections. I suspect actually a lot of people are not going to disagree with me on this, but I have found it really important lately to reach beyond my own friendships, to reach beyond my own party lines, to speak when I can to civic groups, in a couple cases to speak to Republican groups, to try and encourage people to see this. Most of the virtues that I'm talking about here are not Democratic virtues or left virtues. They used to be Republican virtues, and they used to be virtues of the right as well. And I think there is a way to kind of get people back to thinking and talking about that. If only because unless people think that there's no way they're ever going to lose an election again, if I were folks on the right, I would be extremely afraid that the lesson Democrats are going to learn from this is that they can do it too. Now, I don't know if the current folks in power don't ever expect to lose another election because they're going to shift the playing field, or if they don't think that the Democrats could get their act together to use these kinds of aggressive tactics. I think they might be surprised in that regard, or if they're just not thinking ahead, if they have the time horizon of a goldfish. I'm not sure, but Republicans certainly have a vested interest in not having these tools used against them. And for some of them, that's going to mean willingness to allow themselves to be restricted. Not enough, but there's no way that we get back to sort of normal accountability, effective accountability, without the cooperation of moderate Republicans in this regard. Some of you may have seen this joke. It actually started as a British meme post after Brexit. But the idea of people voting for the leopards eating the leopards eating people faces party, who are then upset when the leopards attack them as well. It's possible to have some Schadenfreude when we see people on the other side suddenly affected negatively by the things that the current administration is doing, and that kind of impact is broadening out, whether that be the impact of tariffs or the impact of ICE raids, or simply the impact of government instability on various kinds of investments and so on. But I think we got to break through that pleasure at other people's sadness and actually see anybody who's been negatively affected by what's been going on in this administration as potential allies in this. And so my recommendation there is that we got to be out there looking for people with leopard scars, because those are the people who might be more willing than others, especially the people who might have other kind of views than us. But those are the ones we need to recruit over if we're gonna stop this. The only way this gets stopped is if it has a broad public appeal. At the moment in the United States, the simple left-right divide is kind of down the middle. But on these accountability questions, there is a possibility to create a much broader coalition. I do think that the majority of Americans are in favor of government that respects limits and boundaries. Conservatives used to say that that's what they believed in above everything. And then suddenly many of them do not. But I think that's where we got to look, and that's how we got to work our future efforts. For the long term, I think we got to support those diagonal watchdogs. We got to support journalism. We got to support unions. We've got to support our state governments that are willing to take action around this. That means electing a state government that is in favor of overall accountability. So that becomes a vertical accountability question. But I really think we got to support with our mouths and with our money all of those kinds of diagonal institutions that are important, that are responsible for seeing what's going on, for reporting on it, and for mobilizing people to make that happen. One of which is the organization you're currently in. So you do that just by being on this call and by working with your friends and colleagues that are there. I think in the long run, we got to support some institutional reform. What's happened in the last 9 years has really revealed the problems with American accountability mechanisms and what we need to think and do about those. And there are some groups. The group I work with, Voters Not Politicians, is one of them that's trying to think for the long run. Part of that means restricting the role of money in politics. So the MMOP referendum is one of them. But also kind of broader efforts that we're looking at about electoral reform, shifts to proportional representation, which could provide additional voices in American politics. I think we need to think about some kind of Supreme Court reform. I know we need to think about some kind of Supreme Court reform. And we need to look at the Constitution itself. The US has the hardest to change Constitution in the world, which means that simple, basic, common sense reforms that would be supported by most Americans simply don't even have a chance. They don't even get started. And so how we do that, I'm not exactly sure, because to change the Constitution itself, to make it easier to change the Constitution seems like a lift. But there are ways, we've heard people talk about the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, which is a kind of workaround for the Constitution. I think we also have to really, really raise questions about whether the court is acting in a way that is consistent with what the court should be doing. How we fight that, I wish I had an answer for you, but at least it's something that's got to be on our radar screen. So if anybody does come up with an answer, we immediately jump on and support that. And then the last thing I will say, and I think this is probably something that is familiar to this group, maybe not familiar to every group that I talk about, is I think we got to see democracy as an ongoing, long-term thing that we need to live in. It is something that happens over the very, very long period. I think in America, we got used to the fact that democracy kind of ran, at least those of us who were white, those of us who were relatively well off, those of us, especially men, could look at a system and say, well, that works for me. There's not much I need to do about it. But we didn't treat it as a system that was in need of constant repair and maintenance. And I think if you do see the system of democracy as something we need to constantly pay attention to, we can see how we had a lot of deferred maintenance and we're paying the price for that right now. How we can get back to that, whether we can get back to that, I'm not exactly sure. But at the very least, what we have to do is to live into democracy as a process and to see this as something that is constantly going to take time. We can be sad that it's never going to be maybe what we thought it was. Maybe it never was. It's never going to be maybe what we envisioned it as being, but we can still work to make sure that it doesn't get any worse. And that's our job. At long last, I'm going to stop. I'm going to take questions. You've all been patient in listening to me, but I'm curious what you have to say about this. And let me get rid of the screen so that I can see your faces again. There we are. Hi, all. Talk to me. I see Paul's got a question.
I actually have three, but I'll start with one and not.
All right. We'll come back to you then.
Yeah. The first one is, why is the regulatory function of preventing monopolies failed so miserably?
Yeah, and I didn't even go there on this because there was just too much to do. I've just come off a kind of spate of reading around particularly tech monopolies. I think we did make a turn in the 1970s and 80s. Sometimes it's associated with this notion of neoliberalism, but that's a word that often, doesn't mean much. But I think, even in the 70s, especially in the 80s, we started to say that actually maybe, corporate monopoly wasn't that bad. So we pulled back on that. In the last few years, it's actually gotten more complicated because a lot of the big monopolies are are relatively new monopolies that are built around a different kind of monopoly. So the past monopolies used to be sort of monopolies of process, so that one particular company would occupy all of the control over a particular set of means of production. In the last decade and a half, we've actually seen the emergence of platform monopolies, so organizations that are built around networks of people. Those networks get more valuable the larger the networks get. And so there is a kind of natural tendency toward larger and larger, more and more monopolistic organizations becoming more and more prosperous, and then able to exert more and more control, allowing them to extract more and more profit from that system and use that to maintain their own status. There's a variety of works on this that are really kind of interesting. And one of the kind of more assertive, maybe snarkier one is a book by a guy named Cory Doctorow called Enshittification, excuse my French, but about the ways that the tech monopolies have been able to achieve really dominant size by kind of undercutting regulation, by undercutting competition, and so on. So part of it is our lack of willingness to regulate, and part of it is the systems themselves are less kind of amenable to regulation, and so technology actually plays a role in that. So I wish I had a good answer for you. Doctor has some thoughts about about the growth of unions. He's got some thoughts about kind of technological alternatives to the systems that are there. Since reading the book, I've been trying to wean myself off of Amazon and wean myself off of Google and a whole variety of others. Successfully weaned myself off of Facebook and all social media. It's worth a try. But we really do need an effort. It's interesting, the Biden administration apparently gets pretty high marks from people in terms of its antitrust efforts. And those efforts, of course, immediately stopped when the new administration came in. So I don't think it's hopeless, but this is one of the other things that keeps me up at night. And even if we took away all the political problems, even if we replaced this administration with an administration that hews to accountability norms, even if the Republicans sort of became fans of accountability again, I think we would have a gigantic struggle against the concentration of wealth in a few hands, the likes of which we haven't seen for a century and a half. So, Paul, I think your question is dead on target. And let's just add it to the list of things we got to worry about.
There was a guy with a chainsaw in government for a while that went around trying to stop regulation because he didn't want it for his companies.
Exactly. And if you looked at the inauguration and you looked at the person who was behind the people who were behind the president, those people were worth, I think, a collective $3 trillion, something like that, or trillion. I'm sorry, an enormous amount of money. Actually, the people standing behind the president and one of those shots were worth more than the entire African American population of the United States. Like those guys. And recently, I think UNESCO, one of the UN statistical agencies reports finding that 56,000 people in the world had more wealth than the entire bottom half of the world population. That's not sustainable. The question is, how do you fight that? And that's something that I'm still trying to get my head around. I know a lot of us are, but first step is awareness. We go from there. Great question. Any other questions? Paul's got two lined up, so if someone wants to jump in before that, I'd love to hear your question.
Before we continue with questions, I just wanted to jump in. Thank you so much for speaking to us. We are so glad to have you here. And because we do have a board meeting that follows right after this, we'll do about another 5 to 6 more minutes.
Sure. And I know I went a little long, so I'm sorry for that.
It's so okay. We are so glad that you shared all of your information. And if anyone else has questions like after this 5-minute period, please send them my way or Randy's way, and we can always forward those questions and get some answers, to share with you all.
And I just dropped my email into the chat, so contact me directly if you'd like. Well, hearing none, Paul, I think.
Ask another question then.
Yeah.
And this is kind of a very I don't know. It's a very non-optimistic question, and that is the inherent uh, flaw in our Constitution that's supposed to set up a democracy, but it sets up a Senate that are elected by, two by state, and therefore we have like a small state like Wyoming having exceptional power versus California. So it's inherently undemocratic in that sense. And we also the Electoral College, feeds right along with that. Then does that make it pretty much inevitable that democracy is going to fail?
That one. I mean, I agree with you that it is a problem, right? That it produces a kind of disproportion. It's interesting that if the polarization along party lines doesn't polarize along the size of states, it actually isn't that big a deal. It's really only that in the last 50 years that America has polarized politically, kind of along a big state, small state axis. And so that's what's made it kind of problematic. So, as long as other conditions are favorable, you can live with it. It's not great, but it's like having some kind of chronic condition. You can still get around. I've got sort of chronic ankle pain, but I can still run. But I wish the ankle pain would go away. But if other things happen, then that ankle pain stops me from running. And so I think it is a problem, both the disproportionality and both in the Senate and in the Electoral College. But if the Republican Party were playing by accountability norms, it doesn't doom democracy. It may doom other things that Republicans stand for, but it doesn't doom democracy. But as long as you get this confluence of kind of polarization by state size, in a sense, by rural urban, and you have one of the two political parties that's polarized is not willing to respect those norms, I think you do get into a problem. So it is one of the contributing factors. Certainly, as long as things stay the way they are, there are a variety of political scientists and I think political pundits who see that the deck is stacked heavily against Democrats because of lifetime appointments to the Supreme Court, which are arguably a bigger problem, I would say, and the Senate problem, that it's going to be very, very difficult for Democrats to control the Senate in the longer run. That there are 25 states that voted for Trump all three times, and in almost every one of those states, almost every senator is a Republican senator. So as long as you've got that, states used to split their Senate delegations and so on. They don't do that anymore. So it is a combination of that particular constitutional flaw with all of the others. I think the biggest constitutional flaw is the fact that we can't change the Constitution in any kind of meaningful way. It's the hardest to change Constitution in the world. And so, I spend a lot of time in countries where, in order to change the Constitution, you need a 60% vote of the legislatures. That is thinkable for things like campaign finance reform and other things. You can sometimes get that kind of majority for reasonable, responsible things. It doesn't happen all the time, but it would work. The United States, you need 2/3 of both houses plus 3/4 of the states. That's impossible at the moment. And so it's a big problem. I don't know how to change it because you'd need 3/4 of the states to vote to allow less than 3/4 of the states to vote. And small states aren't going to give away that power. So not a positive answer to you on that, except maybe the only optimistic answer that I can give is that the thing that you identify isn't our biggest problem. I think you actually nailed that one in the first question, but yeah.
Well, I want to thank
question.
Kevin so much for joining us. It is 12:15. So Paul, if you want to email Kevin your last question, feel free, or if you want me to email it, I'm also happy to do that. But let's thank Kevin for joining us today, because it was such a wonderful presentation with so much good information. So I am so glad that you were here today and willing to speak with us.
Absolutely. Thank you all. You know where to find me, and I'm glad to respond to anything going forward. Good luck at your board meeting, and I wish you all a wonderful Saturday.
Yeah, thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you everyone for joining. I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording right here as well.